John Stuart Mill. We will now look at utilitarianism as it has been presented by John Stuart Mill. I am Dr. Sudhnya N. Kulkarni, Associate Professor, Department of Philosophy, Janki Devi Memorial College, University of Delhi. As we saw in the previous presentation, we discussed about certain basic terminologies that are common to utilitarianism as a philosophy. And we also found in the previous presentation that Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, and how his interpretation of the principle of utility was very different from how it has been interpreted by John Stuart Mill, not only its interpretation but also its implications. So we are now going to consider his follower and critic John Stuart Mill's understanding of the principle of utility and his version of utilitarianism. If we look at John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, he also talked about maximizing happiness as the founding principle of utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill went on to publish his book Utilitarianism in the year 1861, and he looks at happiness as the founding principle of this theory. However, according to Mill, Bentham failed. He failed because he failed to distinguish between the qualitative character of pleasures and the quantitative character of pleasures. As a result, because of his hedonic calculus, one could not evaluate or calculate the degree or percentage of pleasures, and thereby he was not able to provide a solution to the challenges of evaluating and measuring pleasures, and thereby failed in categorizing actions accordingly. Bentham's theory thus fell short because it focused on the quantitative aspect of pleasures and not qualitative ones. Further, he failed to realize that there can be no concept of common good that can appeal to all persons and around which a social structure could be formed. In addition, the very concept of happiness, as I have mentioned earlier, is fluid and its implications for individuals are different. Given this scenario and the shortcomings of Bentham's theory of utilitarianism, Mill thought that he ought to rescue Bentham's theory and went about presenting his own improved version, which we are now going to look at and study. John Stuart Mill, born in the year 1806 in a suburb of London, and he died in the year 1873. He was an English philosopher, an economist, a politician, as well as a civil servant. In fact, Mill is regarded as one of the most influential thinkers in the history of liberalism. He has contributed widely to the development of social and political philosophy as well as political economy. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has in fact gone on to dub him as the most influential English language philosopher of the 19th century. If you look at some of his works, you find that Mill was a prolific writer, and he published a number of books. You find On Liberty, published in the year 1859, Utilitarianism in the year 1861, The Subjection of Women in 1869, his Considerations on Representative Government in the year 1861, his book on logic and his books on principles in 1848 and 1843 respectively. We will now look at his work on utilitarianism to study how he went on to improve on the works and theory of Bentham. Mill stated in his book Utilitarianism, and I quote, "The doctrine that the basis of moralities morals is utility, or the greatest happiness principle. And what does it do? It holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong in proportion as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And what would be the reverse of happiness but pain? By happiness is meant pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness is meant pain and the lack of pleasure." We will now look at Mill's defense of the principle of utility in his book Utilitarianism. The book has 5 chapters and each one has given a detailed interpretation of what Mill's project on utilitarianism was. In the first chapter, Mill sets out the problem and distinguishes between the intuitionist and the inductive schools of morality and suggests limits to what we can expect from proofs of first principles of morality. He argues that questions of ultimate ends are not amenable to direct proof. What does it mean? It means that the kind of proof that one would find, say, in the sciences, similar kind of proofs are not going to be available when we are going to look at the principles of morality. In the second chapter, Mill corrects certain misconceptions about the principle of utility. One misconception is that utilitarianism has been endorsing the Epicurean view that pleasures are what matters. If that is the case, then it implies that life has no higher end than pleasure, and it is a doctrine worthy only of swine. In the third chapter, Mill asks, why would one follow the principle of utility? What, in other words, would motivate any one of us to act in ways approved of by the principle of utility? Where does it get its binding force from? In chapter 4, he looks at what kinds of proofs can be given for the principle of utility. No doubt, the kind of proofs that can be given are not of the same kind as the ones that are given for any scientific experiment. He states, the only proof capable of being given that an object is visible is that people actually see it. The only proof that a sound is audible is that people hear it. And similarly with other sources of our experience, in like manner, I apprehend the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it. Now, in this example or argument that Mill has given of demonstrating why the principle of utility cannot be derived on the basis of scientific proof is because the only proof that is a sound, he says, is audible is that people hear it. Similarly, the fact that some action is desirable is that people do actually want it or they do actually desire it. In chapter 5, Mill shows us the connection between utilitarianism and justice. In particular, Mill shows how utilitarianism can explain the special status we seem to grant to justice and to the violations of it. Justice implies which is not only the right thing to do and wrong not to do, but which some individual person can claim from us as his moral right. Thus, Mill's book on utilitarianism examines in detail the various aspects of his principle of utility. We will now look at certain significant quotes from his book, Utilitarianism, to understand Mill's principle of utility and how he went on to interpret it. But these supplementary explanations don't affect the theory of life on which the theory of morality is based, namely the thesis that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things that are desirable as ends, and that everything that is desirable at all is so either for the pleasure inherent in it or as a means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. But it must be admitted that when utilitarian writers have said that mental pleasures are better than bodily ones, they have mainly based this on mental pleasures being more permanent, safer, less costly, and so on. That is, from their circumstantial advantages rather than from their intrinsic nature. And all these points, utilitarians have fully proved their case. And what is their case? That pleasures are preferable to and over pain. What do you mean by deference of quality in pleasures? What, according to you, makes one pleasure more valuable than another, merely as a pleasure, if not its being greater in amount? To this, according to Mill, there is only one possible answer to this. Pleasure P1 is more desirable than pleasure P2. If all or almost all people who have had experience of both give a decided preference to P1, irrespective of any feeling that they ought to prefer it. Thus, we can see from the earlier slides that Mill made a qualitative distinction between pleasures. Mill went on to elaborate on his version of utilitarianism as a normative theory of ethics or moral philosophy. He criticized his opponents by making the distinction and stating that human beings are capable of experiencing intellectual pleasures as well as brute physical pleasures. Intellectual pleasures are intrinsically more valuable than physical brute pleasures. His argument in support of this is that those who have experienced both kinds of pleasures will certainly prefer the higher pleasures. To the question that some people who experience higher pleasures and yet go on to throw themselves into experiencing lower pleasures, Mill's response is that such persons have been led astray by temptations and desires, and they know that higher pleasures are far more valuable than lower pleasures. The question now arises, why should one maximize happiness? Mill's response to this question is that just as we can say that an object is visible as we see it, likewise the fact that happiness is desirable is that people do actually desire it. Each person finds his or her own happiness desirable, so general happiness is the sum of individual happiness and therefore desirable. Happiness is an end in itself. The ultimate goal and end of all human activity is happiness and avoidance of pain. Everything that is desirable is a means to this end. Now we will go on to evaluate Mill's theory. We will now examine the pros and cons of Mill's utilitarian theory. Mill criticized Bentham's theory and offered his own improvements to his theory. But Mill's utilitarianism too suffers from certain challenges. His attempt to justify maximum happiness of maximum number of people is fraught or ridden with difficulties. Mill's proof of utilitarianism is based on unsound arguments. His argument that the basis of happiness is desirable is that we seek it. Likewise, we see an object because it is visible is based on a faulty analogy or comparison. Visible means it can be seen, but the same argument cannot be applied to desirable. Something is desirable does not imply that it is desired. All that it shows is that we may desire it or that it possesses the quality of worthiness of being desired. Even if Mill were to prove that happiness is something that is desirable intrinsically on its own, still one cannot arrive at the conclusion that because each individual desires his or her own happiness, therefore the total of all individual happiness can be added, which would then therefore become desirable, is an argument that seems to be faulty. Further, each individual, while they are desiring his or her own happiness, is a kind of an egoistic interpretation and version, and it is not at all conducive or beneficial to the benevolent utilitarian goal, which is of maximizing happiness of maximum number of people. Mill definitely needed a stronger argument to prove that general happiness is desirable over our own individual happiness. Even if Mill had gone on to establish that there were good grounds to adopt utilitarianism as an ethical theory, still there are some objections regarding its application. One important point to be noted here is regarding assessing which among the actions is going to lead to the maximum overall generation of happiness. In life, we are often faced with situations wherein we are forced to make quick decisions and we do not have the time to deliberate. If that is the case, how is Mill's decision regarding change in pleasures or which pleasure should make me decide which action to pursue remains to be seen. Mill responded to such a challenge by stating that people learn from their experiences. The solution would be to develop general principles that maximize happiness. A rational approach would be to adopt such principles on utilitarian grounds rather than calculate possible consequences. Thus, Mill's utilitarianism suggests developing such general principles and applying them to particular cases. Mill's division of pleasures into two categories has also created difficulties for his theory. The reason being, the pleasures are different not only in degree but also in kind. If this is the case, how does one calculate and measure between pleasures that are integrally different? In other words, these two kinds of pleasures are incommensurable. In such a scenario, how will one apply Mill's utilitarian principles? There can be situations where both qualitative as well as quantitative pleasures are present. Then how are we going to separate the two, integrate the two, or count which amongst the two are to be considered? We may note here that the distinction between higher and lower pleasures by Mill seems to be one in which Mill's interest towards intellectual pleasure gets highlighted. Mill opined that intellectual pleasures were far more valuable than physical ones. This leaning towards intellectual pleasures doesn't make Mill's theory weak or false, but definitely demonstrates his bias towards intellectual pleasures. However, 20th century utilitarians have gone on to adopt a different approach to tackle the various issues that were raised concerning the applicability of Mill's theory of utilitarianism. What did they do? Well, they went on to make two broad divisions of the utilitarian theory into act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Now, the difference between act and rule utilitarianism was introduced in the 1950s by Richard Brandt. Rule utilitarianism argues that there are some moral rules which help to promote general happiness and they must be adopted by all. Act utilitarianism argues that we should consider the consequences of our actions in different cases and decide what is the right thing to do in each case. The key difference between act and rule utilitarianism is that act utilitarians apply the utilitarian principle directly to the evaluation of the individual actions, while rule utilitarians apply the utilitarian principle directly to the evaluation of rules, and then they evaluate individual actions by seeing if they obey or disobey those rules whose acceptance will produce the most utility. The early utilitarians like Bentham and Mill sometimes applied the principle of utility to actions and sometimes to the choice of rules for evaluating actions. This led to debates whether Bentham or Mill supported act or rule utilitarianism, since Mill made the claim that direct appeal to the principles of utility is made only when secondary principles, that is rules, conflict with one another, and in such cases the maximized utility principle is to be used to resolve the conflict. It appears as though Mill favored rule utilitarianism. To summarize, Mill has argued that everything is desired either as an end or as a means to an end, and that end is happiness. However, Mill has also stated clearly in his work on utilitarianism that only virtue is desired not as a means to but as part of happiness. But does the utilitarian doctrine deny, and I am quoting from Mill's utilitarianism, that people desire virtue or maintain that virtue is not something to be desired? Quite the contrary. It maintains not only that virtue is to be desired, but further that virtue is to be desired disinterestedly for itself. Thus, we find that utilitarianism, as propounded by Bentham and John Stuart Mill, offered an interesting approach to normative ethics. They both went on to present a theory seeking happiness as the grounding principle for morality. The reason being, every individual desires happiness and makes efforts to seek it. The theory, no doubt, has had its share of challenges, yet it offered a different approach to understand how to evaluate human actions and continues to inspire many writers to apply different versions of the utilitarian theory even in the present century. Thank you.